Shweta? Is that a person? Shweta?
That sounds familiar, yeah.
I think she's on this too. I think she does, yeah. Cool. Awesome.
Great. All right, everyone, we're going to get started. So I'm really excited to introduce you to our speaker today, Daniel Handel. Daniel has 17 years of experience in international development with a focus on economic growth, cash transfers, and impact evaluation. He currently works at 3IE, the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. And before that, he spent 10 years as a USAID Foreign Service Officer with assignments in Washington, Rwanda, and Nicaragua. Daniel has an MA in economics from the University of Sussex, and his Twitter bio describes him as a curious contrarian. He currently worships at the Church of the Ascension and St. Agnes in DC. Please welcome Daniel.
Thank you so much. This is recording, double checking. Okay, great. All right, good. So lovely to be here. I was kind of frustrated I couldn't be at more of the conference this weekend, but I hope it's been good. It looks like a great lineup, so I'm honored to be part of it. So I'm going to talk today about an initiative called cash benchmarking, which essentially amounts to trying to answer the question of whether through our international development programming we could do more for the poor than they could do for themselves. So first, a quick introduction. I am, in fact, Daniel Handel. I work for the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, and as was just mentioned, I spent 11 years as a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Agency for International Development, serving in Nicaragua, Rwanda, and back in Washington. 3IE, we were basically founded 15 years ago to do impact evaluations to try to figure out which common approaches in international development programming are effective. I have no idea how deep into this stuff you guys are, so in case you're not familiar, an impact evaluation is basically a medical clinical trial where some people are assigned to get a treatment, a program. Some people are assigned to get either a different program or no program, the control group. And then we look at the difference between, over time, how the people who got the treatment, the program, do versus those who didn't. And by doing so, you could typically isolate the effect of the program itself, as opposed to just looking at change over time, which may or may not be a good indication of whether a program was effective. There's a form of impact evaluation called randomized control trial. Again, think your medical clinical trials. There's a few other varieties that we do as well. This is a picture of me at Embassy Housing in Rwanda. And you'll notice some very classic expat things. I have a big SUV, may or may not actually need it for driving around the capital. I have a much bigger house than I could afford if I lived in the US. High walls, razor wire, pretty cut off from the rest of the community, and kind of a smug, ain't I cool look on my face. I'm going to come back to this. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we think we might be doing with foreign aid, the implications of cash benchmarking, and going to quickly run through some results of some studies that I led. And then I'll try to leave most of the session open for questions. As I often say, I grew up in New Jersey. I speak really fast, so don't be daunted by the number of slides. They'll whiz through. I also went to grad school in the UK and kind of like the UK system of holding questions to the end. But if you have something which just cannot wait, that's okay too. Okay, so let's zoom way out. What is USAID's job? And for USAID, you could swap in any large philanthropy, any donor organization. But for USAID, which I know the best, I'm going to kind of use that as a placeholder for funders writ large. So what's USAID's job? It's to be good stewards of US foreign assistance. Congress, since 1961, has given money for foreign assistance. They said, well, we should probably hire some people to administer this aid, so they set up USAID. So the job of USAID is to be good stewards of foreign assistance. And I think this will be an easy sell in this crowd, I think that means maximizing the impact of the money entrusted to USAID by the American people through their congressional representatives. And if you buy that, then it should be pretty clear that comparative cost effectiveness, thinking through how much you could get for a given amount of money, for different things you could spend, becomes really, really important. Administrator Samantha Power, the current head of USAID, this is what she said in her nomination hearing. I will work tirelessly with members on both sides of the aisle to ensure that taxpayer dollars are well spent. Guided by evidence, I will work with you to adopt or replace programs that are not delivering. But what does delivering mean? What's the benchmark? What's the standard? Is it that you run an impact evaluation and you show that the program had no average impact? I mean, that's a pretty low bar. Is it that you spent $100 per beneficiary and improved your given outcome by 10%? Is that good enough? Is that delivering? How about $300 to improve an outcome by 50%? What is the threshold? What's the benchmark? And my pitch with cash benchmarking is to use the impact per dollar of unconditional cash as a hurdle rate of cost effectiveness against which to compare the anticipated impact per dollar of a proposed intervention, proposed activity. This creates a standard of cost effectiveness that can be used to understand how much value is added through the program design, procurement, and management system, basically the foreign aid machine. A simpler way to say that is, are we, the administrators of foreign aid, are we doing more for the poor than the poor can do for themselves? Okay, hold that. We're going to zoom out again. Let's think about a slightly different world. Here are two very famous billionaires who actually attempt to do quite a lot of good for the world. I think they do. Gates and Buffett. So imagine a world where billionaires have taken it upon themselves to help the American middle class. Would that be plausible? Would that be a good thing for billionaires to do? And it might be. It might be that billionaires know the problems in the middle class better than the middle class knows those problems themselves. It might be that billionaires know how to solve, I consider myself middle class, so might be able to solve our problems better than we do. And it might be that we all agree what our problems are and the best way to go about it, but billionaires, just for whatever reason, it's more cost effective for them to implement those solutions than it is for the middle class themselves. And actually, this is not a crazy comparison. I did a quick back of the envelope. If you assume a poor beneficiary of a USAID program makes $500 a year, typical aid worker makes $100,000, making 200 times what the poor make. Well, 200 times an aid worker's salary is $20 million a year. Billionaires are probably pulling in more than that. So it's the same kind of order of magnitude of income difference. And then how would you feel if billionaires went about hiring other billionaires to implement these programs? This is just a picture I found in my own imagination of where billionaires have aid effectiveness meetings. Okay, so all of these might be plausible reasons why it would be justified for billionaires to go around trying to help the middle class by designing programs. They might know our problems, they might know how to solve them better, they might be able to implement those solutions more cost effectively than we could ourselves. So the question is, do you believe these things? And do you believe them about the foreign aid system? That I'm going to use Americans here, stand-in, and Africans as a stand-in. Do you believe that we, USAID workers, know more about the needs of Africans, that we know better solutions to their problems, or that we could implement those solutions more cost effectively? Because you basically have to believe those things to justify the aid system. It's not impossible that we, in America, in the West, might know something that those not in the West don't. So if you look at GDP per capita over time, over the last 200 years, you'll see in 1820 already Western Europe and Western offshoots, that's that blue and orange line on top, we were richer than the rest of the world by a bit, but obviously the income difference has grown dramatically over time. So it's possible that there's some secret sauce that we know, and that it's worthwhile for us to go around and share that secret sauce of development with others. Okay, interlude. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt, but one thing that graph shows, in my opinion and other people's opinion, is that there's an injustice in the global system that's draining the third world of their potential. Is that something that you'll be able to speak to? I'm not putting you on the spot, but is that something that we can talk about during your presentation, or should we wait till after?
We can do that in Q&A. I'd also be curious to hear the thoughts of people around the room. But yeah, that's a great question. So we're happy to come back to this slide at the end. So Feed the Future is the US government's flagship food security program, has been for a long time, over I think 3 or 4 administrations. When I got assigned to my first foreign service job in Nicaragua, like the second week, I was invited into a meeting where we had to decide the 3 crops that USAID should focus on with Nicaraguan farmers. I'm not a farmer, I don't know anything about agricultural value chains, but it was my job to kind of pick 3 things that we should focus on. I don't think that's a very good system. Maybe you do, but that is what the system is. Here's also what the system is. So typically, here on the left is a donor, whether that's USAID, a philanthropy, another donor, multilateral donor. They give money typically to international nonprofits or for-profit contractors who split off some of that money for their own management and overhead, some for fundraising or new business development. They then subcontract to a local NGO who themselves have to cut off some money for their own management and overhead. They then provide goods and services ultimately to the beneficiary. So this is kind of what the typical model looks like today. But it could be like this. So a cash transfer more or less cuts that out, not completely, but more or less cuts it out, and it's just money from a donor to a recipient. So the question is this model more cost effective than this model? And before we get into the math of it, there is this overarching question of ethics. Just is it right to control the decision making of others, even if you could say that it's more cost effective? And my pitch is that it may or may not be. So these are my kids. This is their 5th birthday party. You can see my son is super bummed out because I told him that he had to wait to get his cake till other people had his. And then here's my daughter. She got real bummed out because I told her she couldn't have a second piece of cake until everyone else had had their first. So I just happen to know social graces better than my 5-year-olds. They're now 7. Sometimes paternalism is right. Sometimes it's not. But I think it's definitely not appropriate if we can't make a strong evidence-based case that we're doing more for the poor than they could do for themselves. One more interlude. This is my actual travel authorization, moving me at US government expense from Nicaragua to Rwanda. And as you can see, the US government paid $62,000 to ship my stuff from Nicaragua to Rwanda, like old hand-me-down couches. A lot of it I actually got rid of when I got to Rwanda because I like the embassy furniture better. And that expenditure has an opportunity cost. That is equivalent to the average income of 90 Rwandans, and that's the average Rwandan, not the poorest. So basically, our model is expensive, and we really need to justify that top-down decision-making. Okay, so I'm going to get into the guts of cash benchmarking. That's the kind of the philosophical background. So this is how it might work in practice. You create a benchmark. You get money from Congress, you do an unconditional cash transfer program, and you have some level of impact on an outcome of interest. That becomes your baseline, your line in the sand, your hurdle rate. You then have a typical aid program, more complex, more top-down, similar amount of spending per person, that delivers a different amount of impact per dollar. And the difference between those you could think of as the value add of the aid system, the kind of procurement, the design, the hiring of implementers. But of course, the inverse would also be true. If you're doing programs which are worse than the cash benchmark, it means that the aid system is detracting value. It would have been better to take that money from Congress and get the bureaucracy out of the way and give it to poor people. It seems to me not really justifiable to do worse than giving away. It's not really right to hire people like me and send us abroad if we're doing worse for the money than the poor could do. One key clarification that comes up a lot. The pitch for cash benchmarking is not that we ought to do cash transfer programs everywhere and always. Cash benchmarking tries to draw a line in the sand. So let me give an example here. So here are 5 programs, household grants, cash transfer in the middle. Without that line in the sand, you might look at activities C and D, there on the right side, and say, hey, positive impact, pretty good, let's do more of these. But with the line in the sand, you could say, just having some impact isn't really good enough. You want to be more cost effective than this minimum standard. Now, the problem with this, if you actually have this level of comparative cost effectiveness data, you should do activity A. That's your benchmark. But the point is that without a line in the sand, you may just say, hey, any evidence of impact is good enough, and I don't think that's good enough. Of course, you may come across a situation where cash is literally the most cost-effective intervention. So here's a hypothetical. If you're trying to improve dietary diversity, lots of typical programs, nutrition, savings groups, farmer training. If you really don't think there's anything more cost-effective than cash, that nothing beats the cash benchmark, do cash. I'm totally for it. But they're not the same idea. The case for cash benchmarking is not the same as doing cash. I think people often say, well, why cash is the benchmark? Any intervention could be the benchmark. I think there's a few reasons. It's a very simple intervention. It's very easy to understand. It's very easy to measure. There's a lot of evidence that cash is helpful in a wide variety of domains, at least in the short to medium term. There's like a whole problem in the literature. There's just not a lot of long-term evidence for anything in international development, including cash. And it's really the ultimate integrated program. People use cash for all sorts of things, for health, for education, for investment, for consumption. So the outcomes of a cash transfer program are applicable to quite a few of the sectors that groups like USAID try to work in. It's also pretty cheap, and I'm going to show you a better slide in a second. So the evidence for cash to date is pretty strong. So this is, there's a kind of literature review done by a group called the Overseas Development Institute in the UK, 2016. So they found that cash moves child labor, dietary diversity, female empowerment, health service usage, savings, labor force participation, nutrition, poverty, school attendance, a lot of the outcomes that groups like USAID try to move. Other studies have also found similar effects. The one from the World Bank, people worry that if you give people cash, they're going to hurt themselves. That turns out not to be the case. So I think cash is a good benchmark for a lot of what groups like USAID try to do. It's not applicable for everything, so let me start with what it is. So for programs like farmer training, microenterprise, nutrition, school attendance, savings and lendings, health service use, all typical aid programs, not just at USAID, for which cash has been shown to move those outcomes of interest, so cash benchmarking probably is applicable. There's other, what as an economist we call public goods programs, policy reform, trade facilitation, media freedom, things like that, where cash probably is not a good benchmark. Kind of no amount of cash to individuals is likely to improve the regime of media freedom. These are obviously really important topics, so cash benchmarking is not applicable to everything that we might care about in the development sphere. Okay, so that like truly is the theory. I'm going to whip through a couple of results and then try to get to questions. So I got started with this with a group called Give Directly, which some of you may know. I see people nodding. When they were actually pretty young. So they did the cash programs that we evaluated. We got money from Google.org and a group called the Development Innovation Ventures Div. It's kind of an innovation part of USAID to do cash studies in Rwanda. And then Good Ventures provided money to do cash benchmarking programs in a few other countries as well. But I'm just going to talk about the results from the two Rwanda studies. So the first study is we compared cash implemented by Give Directly to a typical nutrition program implemented by Catholic Relief Services. So this program had 5 components. Also just really typical, so village nutrition schools, community health clubs, farmer field schools, savings and lendings groups, government capacity development. And the first thing we did is to compare the cost. So the Gikarura, the name of the nutrition program, all in spent $142 per beneficiary. That's going to top left cell. But that involved 51% of that was overhead for the program, so kind of direct programming. The amount of money they got through was about $73 per beneficiary. Since the overhead on cash was 20%, and actually almost all the cash program is fixed costs, so as the cash transfer goes up, the overhead goes down. So $142 is kind of a small cash transfer. So here the overhead was 20%. So a lot more, $116 got through to the beneficiary. And if you apply that difference in overhead to the entire $24 million activity, the US government was choosing to spend about $7.5 million more on overhead than it would have if it had done cash. And the opportunity cost is equal to the average income of over 10,500 Rwandans. Again, average, not the poorest Rwandans. So the US government was implicitly saying we could double the income for 10,500 people, but we think it's better to pay overhead for CRS. That may be right, it may be wrong. It turned out it was wrong. Here's what we found. So the cost equivalent transfer was more effective than the nutrition program at reducing household debt, increasing productive assets, increasing consumption durable goods. The traditional program was more effective at increasing savings. Worth noting, neither did anything on nutrition, so neither a particularly good nutrition program, but certainly if you have to pick between these two options, I think pretty clear that the nutrition program failed to beat the cash benchmark. The second study, similarly, was a cash program against a youth workforce development program in Rwanda. It was a more intensive programming. It spent $450 per beneficiary. And cash was more cost-effective at increasing consumption, livestock wealth, income, assets, and subjective well-being. Those results faded but held up 36 months after the end of the program. So we actually were able to go back and do a final survey some years after both programs ended. So again, and this is really more direct because those were the outcomes the traditional program was targeting. That program failed to beat the cash benchmark as well. So what does this all mean? So if you imagine USAID's $40 billion global budget, and let's say just 30% is on the types of programs kind of applicable to cash benchmarking. I think that's low. I mean, I think it's probably more like 70. But let's just say 12 billion of the 40 billion are applicable to cash benchmarking, and the using cash benchmarking kills off the worst programs, and instead kind of funnels funding in a more cost-effective way. And it could improve the cost-effectiveness of that 12 billion by just 20%. It would be the equivalent of USAID having an extra almost $2.5 billion per year to help the poor in perpetuity. So the potential for cash benchmarking, I think, is quite high. Okay, summing up. Take-home points. 1, cash benchmarking asks those designing programs, whether at USAID or philanthropies, other donors elsewhere, to make an evidence-based case to justify those top-down programs. The impact per dollar of unconditional cash should form the hurdle that top-down programs need to clear. And we all need to be humble about what works and consider both the effects and the costs of typical programs. Finally, top-down programs reduce liberty compared to cash and only are potentially justified if they are more cost-effective than cash. And that, in a nutshell, is cash benchmarking. Thank you.
Now we have plenty of time for questions until 1:43-ish, 1:44. Should we go back to that slide where the
Sure.
gentleman asked about it and start that discussion, and then people can feel free to raise their hands. I don't see any questions in Slido, so we can just go to the room after that.
Well, as that graph indicates, and if you go back to 1500, many of the wealthiest, best quality of life parts of the world were places like what are now Latin America, South Asia, China, and because of the West had the advantage of gunpowder and aggression, and structured the markets to enrich themselves, and had the freedom to protect their markets and spend money on infrastructure, which the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank often have a condition not to do. Tremendous advantages accrue to the West and at the disadvantage of the developing nations.
So I have like no special expertise. Obviously, this is a rich and old debate. I tend to think more that a few countries have managed to escape poverty. I think some of the examples you raised are very plausible, good reasons to think that maybe that escape from poverty of the West was at the expense of the global South. But I'm also happy to open up to others and their views of economic history, if other people want to weigh in.
The Chinese were like the top country for most of history, and then that only changed in the 1500s. Like investment, you mentioned there.
And right around 1820, Britain fought 2 wars to force them to take different drugs.
Yeah, and they were on a decline in that time frame. Some of it is cyclical. Like, yes, the West has enjoyed for the past 400 years a rise in disproportionate amount for global welfare. That's starting to change now, where it's shifting back towards the east elsewhere. And I do think that more of these countries like Latin America, Asia, are going to see larger growth in gain of the global wealth than the West will. Because the West is like saddled with debt, they're saddled with maturity of kind of their just catching up there. And they're gonna probably play a bigger role.
Aren't they sort of looked at to the wealthy nations and the banks in the wealthy nations?
Maybe China is, but I don't think the rest. You're talking like consumer debt. I don't think the.
No, I mean the debt to the government agencies and to the banks. Loans to government, which have structural readjustment policies as a condition.
You could say there's some in some areas, but I think, yeah, I think that the West has a lot more that is under their plate than the East. I mean, they've grown. I mean, yeah. So anyhow, I just leave it at that.
This is a really important topic and really deep discussion, and I wonder if we can table it till afterwards so that other
That's
people
fine,
can
because
ask questions, but we should definitely follow up on
what he's
this.
talking about is very important too. So.
Yeah, yeah. We can go around.
How would you describe the like literature on whether cash transfers can scale as an intervention? Because if you were to replace all of the USAID's aid spending, at some point you're like creating inflation in a country instead of creating economic growth. So how do you describe the like ability to scale direct cash?
Yeah. So part of me feels like, oh, I just want to see studies on that. I don't want to speculate, but I could say maybe two things. So there was a study done in Kenya 3 years ago of a Give Directly Cash program to look at inflation effects. And they did not find inflation, they actually found a positive spillover, basically a multiplier effect. So that households in the area, even who didn't receive cash, did well. Basically there's more demand in the general area, and the kind of economic effects of that kind of spilled over to non-beneficiary households. Is there a point at which that would become inflationary? I don't know, plausibly. I think the traditional aid programs are also putting money and resources into the communities, so I'm not sure that cash would necessarily be more inflationary than an equivalent traditional program, but they both might be inflationary. But the one study that I'm aware of didn't find that at a certain level of scale, period.
Some questions over there.
I was,
How would you control for all the variables if you do cash benchmarking and compare it to like another system? Like, would it be on the same group of people or a different group of people? Because I feel like you'd have to do different, because otherwise the impact of one would affect the other. So what does that look like?
yeah, so this is going to get nerdy, so be ready. So the idea with randomization in a study is that if you take a large number of people or villages, Give Directly typically likes to do a whole village, like a really big number, and you randomly assign some to get cash versus nothing versus a traditional program, the law of large numbers says that basically the only thing that will be systematically different between those groups is the intervention. Absolutely, whether the presence of other programs, people's preferences and aptitudes certainly differ, but if you randomly assign a large number of units, systematically the only difference will become that treatment, which is why in clinical trials, obviously people's bodies are all a little different. If you assign a lot of people to get this drug randomly, that the only thing systematically between those two is the treatment that they're getting. Randomization doesn't always work. Economic studies really always have a balance table. Sometimes you randomize and you still, just by dumb luck, end up with imbalance, that there is a systematic difference besides the treatment, which is why you do the math to see if that's the case. So that's one answer. We do worry about spillovers. Like I just said, an example that, people in the surrounding villages had economic benefits. So anything that would actually decrease your measured benefit, because the control group actually would be getting some positive some positive spillovers. You could help that if you have a larger geography so that there's more distance between the units. Good. Okay.
So I think this is also going to be a little nerdy, but when I think of academic econ publishing timelines, people will do a study of a program in 2013 and they'll finally post the paper in 2021 and it's been 8 years. do you think when you're trying to benchmark something with an RCT, we should just take these long timelines as like, well, it's worth waiting a long time to make like a final decision? Or do you think there are things we should be doing to do this faster, maybe less intense papers?
Well, I think there's two answers. So one is it takes a long time for things to get published. It doesn't take as long for them to go up on the web. So like example with these studies, from when we did inline data collection to when we had a live working paper, it was like 7 months, I think. So it then took several more years for it to get into a journal, but the paper, the results were available much more quickly. Depending on what you think about the peer review process, maybe you don't want to trust things which are not peer reviewed. I think people are rightly skeptical of the peer review process as like a great filter for study quality. So that's one answer. The second answer is the power of cash benchmarking is not in doing a lot of these studies where you run cash first program and you look backwards to see which was more effective. The power is using the existing evidence. And actually the USAID chief economist, a guy named Dean Carlin, he is just putting out a meta-analysis, which is taking bunches of cash studies and kind of pooling the results into a single study. And the idea is that you could use those kinds of analyses prospectively. So if you're the nutrition officer in Senegal or somewhere and you say, hey boss, I want to do this program, that person should have to look at like a meta-analysis of cash and say, you know, here's the evidence for what I'm proposing. Well, I think it's more cost effective than cash. So I think the real power in killing off bad programs is prospective use of existing evidence. There's always room for more evidence. I would love for more studies that run these things side by side. But the power is using existing evidence to say, here's like a reasonable case that what I'm proposing is more cost effective than cash.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
So this is like an EA audience. I think people are generally like familiar, like favorable to things like Give Directly. When I proposed this to like a non-EA friend, she works with DAI. She's like, but the whole point of like USAID money isn't to be the most cost-effective program. The whole point is to advance U.S. interests, and U.S. funding is much more used as like a way to be able to, like, more as a diplomatic tool. And so how do you, I guess, like, I know there's some interest in kind of like changing that within like USAID, but it feels like there's sort of like this bigger picture sort of philosophical difference about like what's the point of the USAID funding.
I'm going to do two answers again. Two seems to be good. Okay, one answer is absolutely, foreign aid is part of the foreign policy apparatus, and insofar as the US government is trying to optimize for foreign policy outcomes, to some degree they might be measurable. I don't know exactly what you'd measure, like country voting with us on UN resolutions or something, but you could try to, actually the State Department does try to do evaluations of its diplomatic work. So you could say, okay, like that's an intended outcome of aid programming, or foreign policy wins. What's the metric? See if you can measure it directly. I think the second thing I'd say is USAID says that part of what it's trying to do is create change in development outcomes. So in maybe 20%, only 20% of the purpose of aid is improving development outcomes. You would still want to say, what can we do that's most cost effective for achieving that part of aid's intention? I just made that up, so if that doesn't sound right to you, you can push back. That's my first thoughts.
When it comes to USAID and like the sustainable development goals, like how much do they look at that when it comes to like funding different things in different countries?
So certainly there's a lot of overlap between the sustainable development goals and the types of sectors and outcomes that USAID is trying to improve, whether environmental, economic, health, education, in terms of like freedom, media freedom, gender empowerment, I think there's a lot of implicit overlap. I don't think USAID purposely says, okay, well the SDG, whatever, says this, so we're going to fund it. A lot of that comes from Congress, that most aid money arrives at USAID legally required to be spent on a sector. So it gets X amount of basic ed money, Y amount of higher ed money, and it is illegal to use that money for any purpose outside of that sector. So USAID staff don't have that much flexibility. And then I think, this probably wasn't your question, but I'm going to steal the word sustainable. A big problem, there just aren't that many long-term studies of the cost effectiveness of almost anything. So this one Rwanda study, where we went back 3 years later, is an anomaly. There just aren't that many long-term studies of anything. And for the amount of time that people spend talking about sustainability, there is just scant research evidence looking at the sustained effect of almost any intervention, and that's an area where there's urgent need for research investment.
How do we improve the learning across donor countries? How do we improve the learning of essentially what works? If USAID is now trying to do the cash benchmarking report and maybe they will start implementing it, or just how do we scale up that what works, for example, at USAID to other countries that are significant donors of foreign aid?
Yeah, that's a great question. In principle, the global literature is the global literature is the global literature. For sure, USAID may have a different cost structure, so a given program implemented by USAID versus BMZ in Germany may be different. But one of the things that 3IE does is what we call systematic reviews, where we try to look at literally all the studies on a topic and say, overall, the take-home point from this literature is these types of interventions are more effective than these at achieving an outcome. That's a public good. That is useful for anybody, anywhere funding. So I think more funding of systematic reviews, of these meta-analyses, like I was talking about the USAID chief economist doing on cash, are really helpful. We also run something called the Global Evidence Commitment, where we have 6 agencies, including USAID, who have kind of signed on to help up their evidence game. So that's helping to learn from each other more how to get their organization to do a better job at incorporating evidence. But I think funding these kind of best buy analyses, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and actually 3IE has an amazing database, which is actually how I found out about 3IE, called the Development Evidence Portal, which has over 13,000 impact evaluations, over 1,000 systematic reviews, and the attempt is for it to be a public good, first, one-stop shop for anybody trying to get a quick take on what the global evidence suggests is effective for a different outcome.
Is it working? How much of, for example, USAID's aid is now benchmarking its cash?
So this is interesting and frustrating. So I was just telling, what's your name again?
Riri.
So I came back to Washington I'm going to get to your questions, to help expand cash benchmarking with the help of Good Ventures to some other countries. When the first results came out in the end of 2018, people flipped out at USAID. I got a lot of mainstream media attention, but we weren't allowed to talk about it in our internal Bureau monthly newsletter. And I actually got forcibly reassigned, right? People freaked out. A couple weeks ago, Samantha Power was talking about cash benchmarking to Senator Romney up on the Hill. Cash benchmarking in USAID's policy framework. So from we literally can't talk about it in the Bureau that did this, to the administrator is talking to senators on the other side of the aisle about it, is a sea change and super, super exciting. Like I said, it's in USAID's policy framework. What isn't in the policy framework, in mandatory guidance, is that people have to do this justification. So I wouldn't say that cash benchmarking has kind of fully arrived. It's not required for people to make this evidence-based case yet. Hopefully that'll change. But a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. So we're on step, 87, and we got some more to take. But I'm thankful of how far it's come to date.
We have time for one more question.
Do you have thoughts on you listed some areas that would be infeasible to cash benchmark, policy change or something. Should we be doing something to see if it's worth USAID spending X amount of money on it? And if so, what does that look like when you can't cash benchmark?
On hard to measure policy reform?
Yeah.
So there are some evaluation types to look at those outcomes. So I think within that domain, we should say, if you're trying to go about to like improve parliamentary performance, like what's the evidence on good parliamentary performance? I think it's just very hard to say, should we fund parliamentary performance over media freedom? I think across domains, those cost effectiveness comparisons are just harder, but maybe people smarter than me could figure out how to do it. But within domains, I think you can look at evidence for what works.
Thank you.
That was a short one. We can do.
Well, that was kind of going to be similar to what I was going to say. So.
Okay. All right. Any last speakers? Okay. Well, join me in thanking Daniel. And I'll just pray to close us out. Is there anything that you'd like encouragement for, or that we can pray for you for?
So I was thinking about this. So it's interesting for me being here at VTS, because right before I joined USAID, I was in the discernment process for the priesthood in the Episcopal Church, and found myself at a silent retreat in a monastery and had to kind of pick, and I went down the USAID path. I always wonder, what is there another great calling? Is there another fork in the road? So I would just pray for discernment on being open to forks in the road.
Will do. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us all together to hear this wonderful presentation, and thank you for just giving Daniel all the experiences that you've given him in his life to lead up to this point. And thank you for giving him a place of influence, a place of where he can gather all this research and data and be able to just share out with the people around him and his agency, and also throughout the agencies in the U.S. government, and also with other governments abroad in this global ecosystem, on just what it looks like to do evidence-based development work. And I pray that as all these dollars belong to you, that God, you would help us to be good stewards and continue to just bless the work of Daniel and his team. And I also pray that you would just, as you walk alongside him in his career and throughout his life, take him to the path and the forks where you want him to be. And I pray that you would give him wisdom and discernment in those times and places to choose the right fork. And God, if there's another calling for him, I pray that you would show that to him and guide him. And in the meantime, I pray that God, you would just support him in everything that he's doing for the glory of your kingdom. And I pray in Christ's name, amen.
Amen.